Good morning, Mr. Mahbubani.
Good morning. Good morning. How are you?
I'm very well, and this session couldn't have been better timed. We are supposed to speak about India's century. We speak 12 hours after India-China announced not just de-escalation, but coming back to the 2020 pre-conflict status. And that, I think, is a stepping stone for the India-China relationship normalization. And I think that should be, I feel, rightfully the first question on which we start this conversation. Mr. Mahbubani, how do you read the changes that have taken place, the diplomatic resolution in terms of the India-China standoff? It took 4 years, but your thoughts on diplomatically resolving what was a big standoff between India and China?
Well, first of all, let me congratulate NDTV. You picked a very special day for the for this meeting, and you chose you knew this was coming, that a big breakthrough was coming in India-China relations. It's actually quite amazing to have this breakthrough, because the depth of suspicion between India and China was very serious. And as you know, before that incident in 2020, Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Xi Jinping used to meet regularly. But now they can't meet, they haven't met for 4 years. Hopefully now they can do so. But I want to emphasize also here that I want to emphasize to you also that this is part of a larger global change that is happening in the world. We are experiencing far greater change now than we have in centuries. And since you call it the NDTV World Summit, it's important to emphasize that we have never, the amount of global changes we are seeing is unprecedented, right? We are moving into what I call a new, let me quickly describe the new world, a new 3M world. First M, multi-civilizational. We are no longer dominated by the West. The West can no longer run the world. In fact, the West is losing itself. And then secondly, it's multipolar, and there are other powers also emerging in this world. And thirdly, it's multilateral. So it's a different world. And it's in this context that you're seeing the changes between China and India. Both are adjusting to a new world that is coming in a positive way.
Indeed. And you mentioned multipolar, you mentioned multilateral. Again, these efforts towards normalization happen on the eve of a very significant multilateral framework, the BRICS framework. As someone who's studied China very closely for decades, as someone who understands this region very closely, I want to understand from you, sir, that does this pave the way for the next phase of India-China relationship? What would that be? And also India-China relationship in the context of the multilateral frameworks that you're mentioning, whether it's BRICS, whether it's several others. How do you see that in the context of what the two countries have managed to achieve just 12 hours back?
Well, I think certainly the most important organization that both China and India belong to is BRICS, and you can see that that this is one club that is a sunrise club. Everybody wants to join BRICS. Lots of new members. The G7, by contrast, which used to run the world, is a sunset organization. Its power and influence is diminishing. Its share of the global GNP is diminishing. When this century began, the G7 economies were much bigger than the BRICS. Now they're smaller than. So clearly, this is the one thing that is bringing China and India together. But also at the same time, I must emphasize that China's and India's rise is part of a broader Asian rise. And very few people in India would mention ASEAN, Southeast Asia, where I come from. But in the year 2000, Japan's economy was 8 times bigger than ASEAN. Now it's 1.3 times bigger. And by 2030, ASEAN is going to be bigger than Japan, which was the second largest economy when this century opened. So there are structural shifts happening in the world that we have to be cognizant of. And by the way, both China and India want to work closely with ASEAN.
Indeed.
And so it's a broader rise of Asia.
That's exactly what I was coming to. That when you mentioned that some of the newer economies are now set to become much bigger than developed economies, change the world order. How do you see that new world order? Where do you see the role of India? We're talking about India's century. How do you see India's role in that new world order? And of course, the entire region, how it's likely to be reshaped in the next couple of decades?
Well, as you know, recently I published a column in the Financial Times saying it's time for the United Kingdom to give up its seat in the permanent seat in the UN Security Council to India. And I, by the way, and that's not a frivolous point. It's a very serious point. I was ambassador to the UN for over 10 years. I know the history and background of the UN extremely well. And when the founders of the UN created the concept of the veto, they wanted to give the veto to the great powers of the day, not the great powers of yesterday, right? That's why Germany and Japan didn't get the veto in 1945. So similarly, after so many years, clearly the time has come to change the composition of the great powers of the day. And there's no question that India is already one of the greatest powers of the day. Its economy is now number 5 in the world. By the end of this decade, it will be number 3. And UK, as you know, is slipping down and will probably drop from the top 10 economies in the world. The UK, as a country, is lost. It's elected as a Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who's a joker, who was succeeded by Liz Truss, who was a joke. So clearly the UK has lost its capability of playing a role on the world stage, right?
But do you see the United Nations?
UK's place.
Do you see the United Nations actually surviving these headwinds that the world is facing? Because the one thing that most experts agree on around the world is its redundancy and it's past its due date. Do you see that UN will survive these headwinds? And it will reshape is a second factor. But do you see it surviving these headwinds?
I'm glad you said most experts. I'm really glad you used that phrase, most experts, because in the world that is changing so much, I can tell you that most Western experts are lost. And frankly, as our world is shrinking, as we become a small, interdependent global village, where we suffer from many common global challenges like COVID, like climate change, like financial stresses, we're becoming a global village. Now, you all know you can only survive in a village if you have a strong village council. And we need a strong global village council. So the need for the UN has never been greater. But why is the UN weak? The UN is weak not by accident, but by design. And the great powers, again, the P5, have insisted that the Secretary General of the UN must be spineless. Now, if you pick Secretary Generals who are spineless, clearly the UN is going to be weak. But now when the need for the UN is growing, we must persuade the great powers of the day. It's time to change your attitude towards the UN and select strong, dynamic Secretary Generals like Dato' Mashko, like Kofi Annan, and then the UN will become stronger. But believe me, there is no alternative to the UN.
Okay.
Absolutely none.
Okay. So you've given headlines. We need secretary generals at the UN with some spine, with some ability to speak up. But then let me ask you a question or an area which I feel very strongly about, which is that a lot of strength for nations come from their economic heft. That is at the core of being able to really sit on the high table and make global decisions. At a time when there's a lot of conversation around India being at the center of global supply chains, where do you see that journey? And in that context, do you see the Quad playing a major role? Do you see semiconductors being that big push factor, that tailwind, so to say, for us to really get into the middle of global supply chains?
Well, there's absolutely no question that India has got a magnificent opportunity to play a bigger role in global manufacturing, to play a bigger global role in supply chains, no question whatsoever. But to do so, I think it's important for the Indian economy to open up and integrate with the rest of the world. I'll give you a simple example. There's a regional free trade agreement called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, that, as you know, India participated in the negotiations and so on and so forth. And India decided, it has a sovereign right to do so, not to join the RCEP. But the econometric studies show that India would add billions to its economy if it's integrated with East Asia. And as you know, most of the manufacturing today comes from East Asia. Japan, South Korea, China, ASEAN. They are the biggest sources for FDI, you know. And you know what's amazing? Southeast Asia, ASEAN, has received more FDI than China, Japan, South Korea, India combined. But how did Southeast Asia do that? Because it integrated into global supply chains and into the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. So the opportunities for India are magnificent. And many manufacturers would love to come to India if the conditions were right. But let me add also one other point, which is a delicate point for you, I know, Gauri, that, you know, at the end of the day, if you want to join the global manufacturing supply chains, you still got to integrate to some extent with China. Many of the components still come from China. And indeed, if you want to, for example, become a major Apple phone production facility, which you can,
Mr. Mahbubani,
the components will come from China too.
On the integration with China bit, I think that is where India is fairly integrated. Even the last 4 years, when we continued to face tensions either at the border or diplomatically, our trade ties, they continued. So to that extent, I think the integration between the Indian and Chinese economies is fairly high. But I take your point about the ASEAN economy is doing well. It's also because they themselves are a very integrated system and ecosystem to that extent. Then let me ask you two questions. I asked you about the Quad as well, that will Quad really be the inflection point for changing supply chains? Because they've been tentative about it in the past, but there are now voices within the Quad members saying that we've got to take the next step. Supply chain resilience is the next logical step. Do you see that happening?
Yeah, it'd be actually very good if the Quad stepped up its involvement in economic integration. That would be a very positive development. But as you know, the Quad declares that its primary role is to help cooperate with each other in humanitarian ventures. And as you know, there's a perception, which may be right, may be wrong, that the Quad was set up to counterbalance China. And so it is perfectly natural for the Quad to move on to that area. But as you know, Japan and Australia and the United States are already integrated with East Asia. In fact, the total trade that United States, Japan, and Australia do with East Asia is much larger than the trade they do with India. But if India steps up its trade with the Quad, That's a positive development.
You are sitting in Manila, sir, a country which has been very vocal at, in terms of it's been at the receiving end of aggression, especially at the seas. But this is not the conversation we are having. The conversation is about India's aspiration in terms of this region and its role and the roadmap. To that extent, I want to ask you about the Look East policy. The last couple of months, the Prime Minister, his government have really stepped up the pedal. We've invited countries from this region. The Prime Minister has made visits, for probably in some countries for the very first time, in some after 4 decades. How do you see the Look East policy that India is now embarked on with a renewed sense of urgency and commitment? Connect the dots for us in terms of its outcomes in the next couple of years, maybe a decade?
Well, I think, if I'm not mistaken, he also calls it an Act East policy now, beyond Look East. No, I think certainly I can tell you for a start, if you take Southeast Asia, where Singapore is part of, Southeast Asia has had for the last 2,000 years much closer links with India than with China. And if you look at the 9 Southeast Asian states, 9 have an Indic base. And amazingly, even in the Philippines, where I'm visiting now, when they organize an East Asian summit for the cultural performance for the leaders of, United States, China, Russia, everyone, they decide to have a scene from the Ramayana being performed in the Philippines, a Catholic country. So India's influence in Southeast Asia is very long and very deep. But as you know, there was a colonial era that separated India from Southeast Asia. We need to rebuild the traditional links. But the best way to do so is again through economic integration. It's good that ASEAN and India have a free trade agreement, but I think India needs to also integrate more with the other countries in East Asia too. And believe me, this is where the future markets are going to be. Let me give you just one statistic so you understand my point. The future economic growth, the markets are going to come from what's called the CIA countries. Now, CIA is not Central Intelligence Agency, by the way. CIA is China, India, ASEAN. Now, you add up the total population of the CIA countries, 1.4 billion, 1.4 billion, 700 million. It comes to 3.5 billion. Now, among these 3.5 billion people, in the year 2000, only 150 million people enjoyed middle-class living standards. Only 150 million out of 3.5 billion. But by 2020, the number had exploded to 1.5 billion. And by 2030, it will reach 2.5 to 3 billion. Now, never before in human history have you seen such an explosion of middle-class populations of this size and scale. Never. Here it's happening in our region. So for India to act east or look east, it is definitely going to have to integrate with this region. That's where the future growth markets are. And psychologically, therefore, I know many in India still want to look west to some extent, but the West is completely lost geopolitically and economically. And frankly, as you watch the populist parties, even domestically, the West is in trouble. That's not where the future growth is going to come. Certainly not from Europe. Certainly from the United States, yes, but not from Europe. So therefore, looking east and acting east is the future for India.
Indeed. And sir, final question as we wrap this up, which is that this session is called India Ascents, diplomatic high table that we want to be on. And I feel we are already on. I feel strongly about it that the ascent has started. We are on that journey. There are many voices that are coming in that we need to be a main player, if not an active stakeholder, whether it's in conflicts, whether it's in economic integration around the world. In your assessment, quickly, the top 3 things that we should probably be focusing on to increase the pace of this ascent.
Well, I think there's no question, you are right, India is already at the high table. But at the same time, when Prime Minister India demonstrated that he could visit both Russia and Ukraine, he showed that India can play a very valuable bridging role. So certainly, if India stepped up its contributions in trying to find a peaceful solution for the Ukraine problem, that would be a tremendous contribution. Similarly, India is one of the few countries that can talk to the opposing sides, talk to Israel, talk to Iran, and certainly talk to all the Arab countries. And then here too, India can make a major contribution to solving a problem that is worrying the world a great deal. And as you know, finally, at the UN, I think it's time for India to make its case more clearly why it needs to become a permanent member of the UN Security Council immediately. And frankly, nudge the UK and say, okay, you've had your day. It's time for you to move on. And if India takes UK's seat on the UN Security Council, the world will cheer because they know that India will provide a perspective that will be understood both by the West and the East and the North and the South. That's a unique bridging role that India can play.
Indeed, indeed, Mr. Mahbubani. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this session. And I agree with you on so many fronts, including the fact that we are in the Sunrise Club and not the club of the has-beens that G7 is becoming. Thank you so much for this conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.